So recently the Barebow rules have changed that now allow you to mount the weights up on the top of the riser above the grip. Previously you weren't able to actually mount any sort of weight above the grip, not even in front of the riser, even though you can't see it, at least from the archer's perspective. And also, the rules have changed to allow dampers to disconnect the weight from the bow itself. And so since releasing these Kaminski Archery dampened barebow weights, I've gotten a lot of questions actually through my website asking where to put the weights on the riser and why you should actually put them there. So instead of spending the time to answer all of those emails, I figured I might as well just make a standalone video addressing where to put the actual weights on the riser and how it can actually affect the way it feels, how it balances, how it aims, and ultimately how the bow performs. So I'm gonna basically take these all off of my bow and start mounting them in different locations. And then I'll shoot a couple of shots and describe to you what I'm actually feeling outside of different mass weights itself, but where they actually are on the riser is gonna dramatically affect how the bow balances and definitely how it reacts after the shot. Now, if you're interested in checking out these dampened barebow weights, I will have links in the description below and a card at the top there to KaminskiArchery.com. You can also go to jakekaminski.com as well, and you can check out our dampened barebow weights that are available in stainless steel as well as black in 3 different sizes from 8 to 21 ounces, and we are shipping those worldwide from 2 different locations in the US and in Europe. So if you are in Europe, these are currently available and they're in stock in both locations, and people are loving them so far. So what I'm going to do with the weights is I'm going to first take them off of my bow, and I'm going to start with just one single weight. I'm going to start with a 14-ounce weight only. Now, the main thing that I am looking for on a barebow, especially when it comes to modifying it with weights and putting it in different locations, is I want the bow to naturally balance vertically. As you can tell right now with my hand in the grip here, it's just kind of, I don't know, wanting to tip back towards me. And if you've ever had an experience where you've shot your barebow and when it shoots, the bow wants to rock back and that top limb actually wants to come backwards and hit you on the top of the head. And I think I'm not going to like just having this 14 ounce here in the main stabilizer bushing. I'm gonna go run inside and grab a 21 ounce to actually put in here, because just one single 14 isn't quite enough to get that bow to balance how I'm liking it to. So I'm gonna take the 21 ounce that I just went and got, and I'm gonna put it back in that main stabilizer bushing, and we'll see if it affects the actual balance of the bow, and it does a considerable amount. So if I'm just gently holding onto the bow, you can see now that the string almost sits vertical and it doesn't want to rock backwards towards me nearly as much. So for me, that would be roughly a good starting point to be at when you're putting a weight on your bow, whether that be in the main stabilizer bushing or somewhere else. Try to get the bow to balance at least vertically, at least as much as possible. For me, the bow just seems to react so much better. At least it reacts much similar to like a bow reaction that I like to feel. So I'm going to back up enough so you can see the reaction of the riser and see how the bow reacts after I let go of the shot. So overall, the bow definitely sits pretty decent, and when I let go of it, I can feel like it almost wants to kind of rotate backwards upon release, just like I mentioned, and as I could tell, you know, just holding the bow statically, it was going to do that. And it just kind of wants to rock a little bit backwards on me when I let it go. Now I'm going to take the same weight and just move it from the main stabilizer bushing down to the lower pocket in the very front of the bow itself. Now, what I find that I have experienced in the past putting weights down here is a little bit of what's called a plumb bob effect, or an effect that actually helps pull the bow down more straight, and it naturally wants to fix the canting because the weight itself, when you're canting, moves outside of the center line, and therefore it wants to naturally swing back underneath the grip to help hold that bow vertically still a little bit more naturally. And now you can see that it's even more difficult for the bow to rock backwards. And so what that's going to do as it rocks further backwards is that weight is moving further out away from where the bow is pivoting around the grip, and therefore it wants to actually hold it more vertically still naturally. And what I'm feeling down there is definitely, like I'm saying, more resistance to that rotation. It wants to stay nice and still, but I'm actually feeling a little bit of a funny vibration where the limbs are reverberating and shaking a little bit more violently after the shot. Now, I have tuned my bow to have the tiller split and the crawl and the knocking point and all of those things balanced and set up for what I originally had on my bow, which was a 14, a 14, and an 8. But because I've had so many questions, I wanted to break out this video and make it for you so I can describe to you how the bow reacts with the weights in the different locations. And it definitely wants to stay more still, the riser does. It doesn't want to move as much upon release. Now, I think that's just because it's a little bit more stable when I'm at full draw, and it's not wanting to rock or tip or move in any sort of orientation that I don't want it to. So it feels a little bit more stable when at full draw, but I do have a little bit more vibration because it's a little bit unbalanced, right? The bow was set up for a completely different setup that's much more neutral as far as weight being distributed throughout the riser itself. Now, this is only aiming flat. If I was also shooting field archery and aiming uphill and aiming downhill, having one weight in one location can really affect the balance of the bow as I'm starting to aim up and downhill. I have no experience with that, personally speaking, so I don't really have much to say on that comment or that subject at this moment. At some point in the future, I will experiment with that. That way I can make a good resource for you to check on if you're interested in shooting field archery, where you may want to put your barebow weights. But for today's purpose for this video, this is for more flat shooting, you know, kind of some basic field archery, indoor archery, or outdoor archery with barebow. Now I'm gonna take an 8-ounce weight and put it in the top pocket. Now the 8-ounce weight is nice as a top weight because it's not terribly heavy. It's just a little bit more mass weight. So now the bow is very, very neutral. The string is at least perfectly vertical. It's not rocking backwards anymore that I could see to my eye. And when I pull it backwards, I wouldn't say it's more resistant to movement backwards because now this weight is moving back relative to the pivot point where I'm holding onto the bow. But it still wants to sit nice and stable and nice and vertical on its own. Definitely very different compared to just a single ounce, or a single weight rather, on the bow. It's a little bit slower moving, but it is not as lazy as far as the adjustment is concerned. So on that shot, I came to full draw, started to aim, and then I purposely moved to a different spot and watched how quickly it reacted. And it moved very stably, like, you know, was very stable. It didn't tip or tilt or adjust, but it was very fast to move because of a little bit more balance, in my opinion. It just seems like the bow reacts to input a little bit better in my experience, and overall it feels less lazy when aiming. And really it just sits super still when I'm aiming. And the bow, when it jumps forward, it doesn't kind of jump unevenly as it's coming out of my hand. With that weight above the grip itself, it feels like the bow wants to launch out of my hand straight and then do a reaction. Instead of reacting and then coming out of my hands, it's just far more dynamic as far as the jump out of the hand, and it's way more even. I just don't feel a desire of the bow to want to move unevenly or have any sort of imbalanced feeling. It just feels much more neutrally balanced, in my opinion, and especially it jumps out of the hand far more even, far straighter. Feels like it's going to deliver the arrow far straighter and not have any weird influence on it as it's coming out of the bow because of the uneven weightedness with that weight in the bottom pocket. I'm going to go pull the arrows So I can shoot a couple more. I'm gonna move this 21 into the main stabilizer bushing next and make some comments on that compared to having it here down low. So now with the weight just in the main stabilizer bushing, if I bend it backwards, it definitely wants to stay back. It's not wanting to balance back towards the front. But if I balance it forward, it also wants to stay balanced towards the front. So it would be very interesting to see aiming up and downhill. I bet you would feel far more reactive and far more neutral with the weights in this kind of configuration, at least uphill. If I'm aiming downhill, it feels like the bow wants to tip down a whole lot more, but it's definitely different compared to having it in the bottom pocket. So this is the 21 in the main and the 8 in the top. Yeah, and it definitely is very, very tippy, and I wouldn't call it more stable, but the bow is quieter and seems to be much happier. Definitely a little bit more dampening of vibration. I think that's because of the way the bow is set up, the way that my tiller split is set and my knocking point and all of that stuff for my tune. Yeah, I think I do like it, but I think I may have to adjust my parameters on my setup to kind of make the bow a little bit more steady at full draw. It just seems like it feels almost lazy where it's staying put and it's not as reactionary to my input, but it just feels like maybe it wants to move a little bit. I think that's because of my individual setup with my tiller split and things like that, and it may be different if I were to adjust that. But overall, I definitely think it's interesting, and maybe it'd be very different in field courses when aiming up and downhill. But for what it's worth, I do like having the 21 down here in the lower pocket. It just seems to want to be far more stable for me and wants to balance a little bit more. Let's see here. I'm going to take this 21 off, and I'm going to put a 14 in the main and a 14 in the bottom, and I'm going to leave that 8 ounce up top. Now this is what I have been shooting with for a little bit of time, and I really like the feel of this personally. It stays nice and vertically still. As I tip it back, it does want to rotate further forward. As I tip it forward, you know, it just kind of wants to sit more neutral or a little bit angled forward, kind of like an Olympic style recurve on its own without too much input. It just does its own thing. Plus, with at least some of the weight down in the lower pocket, it wants to remove my cant, at least a fair bit of it, naturally without any input from myself, due to that effect where it's actually pulling the bow vertically straight up and down. If I were to aim uphill, you know, it wants to pull down because of that vertical stability, and aiming down, it actually feels quite good. So it feels more naturally and neutrally balanced, and I think having weight a little bit more evenly distributed throughout the system like this kind of adds to that kind of feel where it's just neutral, and it should be relatively boring, but that's a good thing. It shouldn't feel crazy because you want it to work with you, not against you, at least in my opinion. Yeah, now the bow is really quiet, although I'm adding more mass weight as well as more dampers, and the bow is definitely tuned for this setup, so overall it feels very, very good. It aims very, very steady, and the bow jumps very, very straight out of the hand. When I had just the 21 in the main stabilizer bushing, it didn't feel like it wanted to jump as straight out of the hand as it did with the 21 in the low and the 8 in the top. But now it just, the bow isn't as reactive. It doesn't jump as hard with just the 21 down here and the 8 up here, but with the two 14s and the 8, it sits in the hand really well, and I can definitely feel the bow wanting to jump straight out of the hand, but it's not as dynamic. It's not as much of a launching out of the hand, but it definitely is super stable because I can feel the contact the entire time. It doesn't prematurely jump out of my hand or leave my hand super fast. It sits nice and solid. I can feel the bow deliver the arrow. It jumps out of the hand nice and straight, and then it does a little bit of rocking, but not a bottom pocket kick or a top pocket kick. It's very, very stable. Now, what I have seen some people do is take one of these bows, and I've seen them put some weights down here because there's a stabilizer bushing down and behind the actual stabilizer, or the grip rather. And so what I'll do is I'll take that 8 off the top and I'm gonna screw it down here behind the grip and see what happens. Now, when I shot Olympic style recurve and I first started, I put a weight down and below the grip down here with just a long rod out front because honestly, Butch Johnson did it way back in the day. And so I put it down there and the bow felt pretty good. I didn't have V-bars at the time. And now the bow, with it down here, it just feels like it's heavier. The bottom pocket is far more weighted, the bottom half of the riser. The string is sitting pretty much vertical. When I tip forward, it really wants to get vertical. I tip it back, pretty much immediately wants to return to vertical, and it wants to stay nice and straight. If I'm aiming up, it's actually pretty good, pretty neutral. Aiming down, it really wants to tip back vertically. So I don't know how it'll feel. It'll probably just slow the reaction of the bow down. It may not jump out of my hand as hard. Now, that one, it actually felt really, really stable when aiming. Didn't want to move a ton. I wouldn't call it as dynamic or as responsive to some input. We'll try. I'm going to aim in a couple different spots this time. Yeah, it definitely is quite resistant to movement, which could be a good thing depending on the style of shooter you are, depending on the type of aiming you're doing. I wouldn't say I like the reaction though after the shot. I can feel the bow wanting to kind of kick and be imbalanced out of the hand, similarly to when I had just the one weight down low. Overall, the bow isn't as happy, and it definitely doesn't launch out of the hand how I like it to, where it kind of pops out of the hand and jumps towards the target. Why I like that is because I like to know that the bow is jumping out of my hand straight and consistently every time, because then it's delivering the arrow straight and consistently every time as well. So I'm going to try one more thing because I'm sure somebody's going to ask. I'm going to put a 14 down behind the grip, leave the 14 in the main stabilizer bushing. Then I'm going to take that 21 and put it back in the lower front pocket. Now this is a very, very heavy setup. I don't think most people are going to be shooting this thing. There's now 4 of these weights on, tipping forward. It wants to stay quite vertical, tipping back. A little less reactionary on that. It wants to stay a little bit more tipped back. Now that my arm is really tired, because this thing's getting really, really heavy, it'll still be interesting to shoot it to see how it actually feels. And it's reacting very similarly to how my bow felt, my recurves feel, when I overload them with too heavy of a stabilizer setup. Let me shoot one more and I'll describe to you what I'm feeling. Overall, the bow feels pretty good. Doesn't jump very hard. Feel a little bit more limb flutter. The bow just feels quite unruly, not really dynamic or responsive when I let go. I mean, I wouldn't say I don't like it, but it is not very responsive. When I aim, and I was picking different places to aim on the bail, I would aim in a spot, move to another spot, and it would kind of continue to move past it and then come back. And so that's what I'm saying when I say it feels like an overloaded recurve stabilizer setup. When you're aiming in a particular place, and say the wind gusts, and you have to come back to the center, if the stabilizers are too heavy, you can kind of overshoot it, and then it takes a lot longer to come back, and it's just kind of, it's unruly and it's not really stable. But when you're really still and you're on, that thing's never gonna move. but it can definitely be overloaded or overdid if you go too heavy and overshoot the overall mass weight. And I think that's what I've done here. If I drop this to an 8, that's only 6 ounces in savings. It's really not going to be that much of a difference. You know, maybe 2 14s, an 8 and an 8. But either way, upon release, the bow is not popping. It's not jumping out of my hand. And if you've been watching this channel for any period of time, you'll know that I really like a dynamic setup where the bow jumps very hard out of the hand and delivers and launches that arrow very straight. I use it as a bit of a feedback guide for myself. If I feel the bow jump and pop to the left and I hit left, well then I clearly did something different. If the bow jumps and pops straight, I'm definitely in much better shape because I'm hoping that arrow is going to hit right behind where I was aiming, and it usually happens that way. So if I'm doing my job correctly by putting pressure into the bow correctly, the bow jumps and launches out of my hand in the exact same way that I'm putting pressure. Therefore, it's launching the arrow in that exact same way too. So I look for a setup that is very neutral, very responsive, yet very dynamic where it wants to launch out of the hand straight. So for me, what I found is semi of an even distribution of weight, where you've got it all in the front of the bow. Anything that I've experimented with by putting weight down and behind the grip in the back, it just tends to slow down the movement of the bow, which could be helpful maybe if you're really overdoing it on hand pressure and changing torque and all sorts of other things. That might slow things down and make it a little better for you. But in my opinion, it makes the bow a little bit too lazy. And I'd rather have the bow just be very neutral and responsive to my input. So when I'm a little bit off and I need to regroup and get that point back in the center to aim with, it goes right back to the spot and then stops, and I don't overshoot it with too much mass weight. Definitely running weight in the top pocket makes a huge difference in my opinion. It changes the way the bow balances. It feels far more neutral, and when you shoot the shot itself, the bow is not so inconsistent and uneven upon delivery. It's not launching backwards, and it's not just kind of doing what it wants to do. It launches straight and then it reacts a little bit afterwards, long after the arrow is out of the bow. So in conclusion, in a rough sense, where I like one weight by itself, if I'm only going to put one weight on the bow, is probably going to be in the bottom pocket. The reason though that I like it there is because the bow aims very, very steady. It doesn't jump as beautiful as I like it to, right? It's a little funky where the bottom pocket hits and then it just doesn't feel even. But if I was going to put one weight on the bow, that's where I'd put it down low. You could put it in the middle, but then the bow just doesn't want to help itself by holding straight. It still wants to lean back quite a bit. And with a bow that does that, it really feels like sometimes that top limb wants to hit you on the top of the head as you let it go. It wants to rock back like this upon release, and so I'm not a fan of that. That's why I'd rather have it in the bottom. But if you want a bow that feels much better and jumps straighter, vibrates less, overall feels like it's more responsive, definitely splitting up the weights and putting one on the top, keeping one either down in the bottom pocket, and maybe experimenting with it in the main stabilizer bushing. You know, this is really easy. I've swapped these weights to various different positions, put on various different weights, and it's taken very little time. You know, the only exception would be if you have a wrist sling that's bolted underneath the actual weight itself, then you have to, you know, work on reconfiguring your setup. But otherwise, it's really easy to just unscrew the weight, put it in a different area, and shoot a couple shots just like I did here. Note how it feels, and maybe even note your performance. You can shoot a 30 arrow scoring round and go from there. And you can always change it back. Just keep detailed notes. Why do you like it? Why do you not like it? And then in the future, you'll be able to make a better decision when you get a new bow, new setup, new weights, or you're just looking for a difference in feel of the bow. You can just put those weights in various different places, and you know, you really reap the benefit of your own research. But hopefully this serves as a basic guide for you. And if, like I said, if you're interested in grabbing one of these dampened Barebow weights from Kaminski Archery, just head to my website, jkaminski.com. Links in the description below. Also a card at the top up there. And there should be one of those featured product banners now on the videos where you can easily check out these weights. And also, if you wouldn't mind, if this video did help you, hit that subscription button and the notification bell down below. Consider sharing it, because genuinely that really helps this channel grow and I appreciate it. Hey, if you like this video, consider sharing it. Genuinely, that would help this channel grow. Also, if you wouldn't mind, please do consider supporting this channel. I produce all this content for archers around the world to enjoy for free. I can't thank my supporters enough. Without you, I wouldn't be able to produce this content, at least not to this level. So thanks.